June 18th, 1178. Canterbury, England. Just after sunset in Canterbury, England, a group of humble monks at the Canterbury Cathedral witnessed something in the sky that would baffle them beyond belief. As the 5 monks were watching the moon rise into the night sky, a tremendous explosion would take place. The crescent moon they were watching suddenly burst into flames like a giant fireball. The monks couldn't describe what they were witnessing, and what they witnessed that day, the great English monk Gervase of Canterbury would describe the moon as splitting into 2. What happened that night in June of 1178? Why were these monks the only ones who witnessed this fiery explosion on the moon, and what could have caused it? Was this some type of meteor or comet crashing into the side of the moon? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we examine another ancient tale of history that remains shrouded in mystery. What did the monks witness that day? And could they have truly experienced an explosion of cataclysmic proportions on the moon's surface? Today, we explore the day the moon split in 2. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you were listening to this episode on Spotify, please turn on post notifications. If you like this content, you want to hear more of it, turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you happen to be listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out within the algorithm. If you want to check out more of this content of mine, I greatly appreciate it. Feel free, if you're listening to this on to go ahead to follow me on my socials at Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown, TikTok, the same handle. And while you're at it, you can also feel free to send me topic suggestions to my email inbox or Instagram direct message. My email is unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. But with all that out of the way, on today's episode, we have a fun one. Not in the potential destruction of the moon, of course. That isn't fun. But the whole premise for today's episode I find fascinating, and I had no idea that this event took place until I started researching and digging into this a little bit more, and it is a head-scratcher, to say the least. You know, you start to think about what these monks witnessed that day, and then why perhaps no one else saw it. And if this event did happen, is there any physical proof to back it up? This would seem like a major event in human history if true, and the fact that it is relatively unknown is very, very interesting to me, and that's why I felt like it would be a great topic for this week. So how today's episode is going to work is that we are first going to dive into the events of June 18th, 1178, and what the monks saw that day. Go into another similar event in kind of historical and kind of religious stories where the moon was supposed to have been split in 2, go over some possible theories into this, kind of like deep dive into some of these theories, and then wrap it up with my own personal theories about what could have been responsible for what the monks witnessed that day at Canterbury Cathedral. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about who this story takes place with. And our story starts with the monk who documented this entire story that day, and that was Gervase of Canterbury. Now, very little is known about the life of Gervase, as it seems much of his life is a relative unknown. What we do know is that Gervase was not only a monk, but also a chronicler, and documented religious events and the lives of kings during this time period. Gervase was most likely ordained by his brother, St. Thomas of Canterbury, and Gervase acted as a senior advisor of sorts within the church, and took on a prominent role within the church, and took on a role as well with solving disputes between the monks of Christ Church of Canterbury and Archbishop Baldwin, who served as an archbishop from 1185 to 1191. Now, Gervase also held the title of sacristan during his time in his life, which means he oversaw the room in which kept the Pope's garments and other religious artifacts secure. Now, it seems like Gervase would vacate this position of sacristan in 1197, and after that, the rest of his life remains a little bit of a mystery. Now, we know that Gervase was still working as a chronicler and started writing and contributing to the chronicle known as Gesta Regum, I hope I pronounced that right, Gesta Regum, which documented the life of kings during the 12th century. But as the style of writing would actually change in Gesta Regum, and it would change in 1210. So this is kind of believed this is when actually Gervase of Canterbury would pass away, and a new author would take on the role of that. However, it is not fully confirmed when Gervase of Canterbury passed away, and like I mentioned, kind of once it seemed like he vacated the role of sacristan within the church, his life remained more of an unknown going towards the later years of his life. But overall, a very mysterious figure that we don't know much about, and even though he is kind of looked at this kind of very secretive person, this very secretive man who, like I mentioned, whose life was not documented very well. However, the little bit that we do have, we're looking at somebody who took his role within the Christ Church of Canterbury very seriously, and while Gervase of Canterbury did not hold, any significantly high rankings within the church, it is very clear that Gervase had dedicated his life to it, and he took it very, very seriously. And why I wanted to talk about that first is because I think it provides a little bit into context of the story that we're going to dive into here in just a few seconds. Now, again, you're talking about somebody who is a professional within his religion. So you would kind of naturally think that maybe this story is not a fabricated hoax, like you might originally think that this might be some made-up story that was created for some unknown reason. That still remains unknown, and of course we will talk about that in theories, but I wanted to provide a little bit of context because, by all accounts, Gervase of Canterbury, what he contributed to the church, his time he served as sacristan, the time he spent as a chronicler documenting lives in the church, solving disputes between other members of the church, and everything like that. It does not seem like this is somebody who would kind of throw caution to the wind and write a story that was completely fabricated for some unknown reason. Doesn't seem like that, but of course, like I mentioned, we will dive into that here in theories. But again, overall, he didn't hold any significantly high rankings within the church, but again, he dedicated his life to it. This was something he took very, very seriously, and it is clear that even though we don't know a whole lot about him, he was a major figure in the church during this time period. Now, while Gervase of Canterbury would work at the Christ Church of Canterbury, he would work with numerous other monks who worked inside the cathedral. And it was the night of June 18th, 1178, when 5 of these monks would come to Gervase with a crazy story. The monks told Gervase that they had just witnessed something they could not explain, and that a massive explosion was witnessed while they observed the moon. Gervase would go on to chronicle this story, and this is what he wrote. And I quote, "They saw the upper horn of the moon split in two." Furthermore, Gervase continues to write and says, and I quote, "From the midpoint of the division, a flaming torch sprang up, spewing out, over a considerable distance, fire, hot coals, and sparks. Meanwhile, the body of the moon, which was below, writhed as if it were in anxiety, and to put it in the words of those who reported it to me and saw it with their own eyes, the moon throbbed like a wounded snake. Afterwards, it resumed its proper state. This phenomenon was repeated a dozen times or more, the flame assuming various twisting shapes at random and then returning to normal. Then, after these transformations, the moon from horn to horn, that is along its whole length, took on a blackish appearance." So this in and of itself is a very fascinating sighting, and by all accounts, this should have been something that other cultures around the world would have had similar stories of this, if this did in fact happen. And that is actually where you would be wrong. Other cultures such as those in China, Japan, and Arabic cultures don't have an account of this story taking place in 1178, and it honestly seems like a one-off that was solely witnessed by these 5 monks at Canterbury Cathedral, which then, I guess, begs the question, was this something that actually occurred, or did the monks make this whole story up for some reasons unknown? Now, theories persist about what this possibly could be, with perhaps the largest theory being that what the monks saw that day was the creation of the Giordano Bruno crater on the moon's surface. Now, that theory, that this explosion they witnessed on the moon was the creation of the Giordano Bruno crater, was proposed in 1978 by a geologist named Jack B. Hartung. Now, Jack thought that the description of events sounded like an asteroid or meteor making contact with the moon's surface. Now we know that Giordano Bruno, the crater, named after the Italian philosopher of the same name, is the youngest crater on the moon's surface, and at the time, we did not have a precise date or estimate to when this kind of meteor crashed into the moon that created Giordano Bruno. However, if Jack Hartung's hypothesis would be right, there would be some holes in this thought process. Firstly, Giordano Bruno, if did in fact strike the moon at this time, the 13-mile wide rock that impacted the moon would have caused significant repercussions for us living on Earth. For example, the impact would have spit up considerable rock and debris from the moon's surface, which would have been rained down to Earth and in the atmosphere. It would have been a visible planet-wide meteor shower for up to a week, and if something like this would have occurred, you would have assumed that it would be documented in writing throughout other cultures. Again, planet-wide meteor shower, you would think there'd be some documentation of that, and we don't have that. We do not have any evidence from other cultures that a meteor shower of this magnitude occurred whatsoever, and definitely not during this year or during this time period. Now, obviously, we have a much better understanding currently of when Giordano Bruno was created, but back during 1976, we didn't know that. Now, Giordano Bruno, even though it is one of the youngest craters on the moon's surface, judging by its impact ray pattern left behind, it is still estimated to be a staggering 4 million years old, not only a mere 1,000. Now, this idea of the moon splitting in two is not necessarily new, as this idea has deep roots within other religions, most notably in the Muslim faith. Now, there are different interpretations of what the splitting of the moon symbolizes in the Muslim faith, but almost all of them have to do with the Prophet Muhammad. However, there are many different interpretations of what this means, and many of them don't actually talk about the moon splitting in two, but more or less something that is being used to explain a lunar eclipse. Now, some stories within the Muslim faith also describe these lunar eclipses, or images of the moon, quote-unquote, splitting in two, as a symbol of the end times. Now, of course, in modern times, this lunar eclipse would be an explainable phenomenon, but in the Muslim faith, the splitting of the moon and these eclipses were proof of Muhammad's power as the prophet. Now, some scholars in the Quran were doubtful of Muhammad's prophethood and wanted him to prove his ability if he truly was the prophet. Now, Muhammad would relate his prophecies about the end of times, and some scholars within the Quran would dismiss these claims of the end times. Now, again, if I got any of that information wrong, I do apologize. I am not a religious person by any means, so my knowledge on all things religion, especially the Muslim religion and things like that, I'm very not as knowledgeable. So if I got anything wrong in there, I do apologize. Feel free to correct me. That was what I was able to find. That was kind of a little quick synopsis that I could put in kind of an easily digestible format for all of you who might not be very well in tuned with the Muslim religion, but I want to share that with you because there does seem to be a track record of this idea of the moon splitting in two through historical and religious significance. Now, in modern times, the idea of the moon splitting in two that was talked about in the Muslim faith in the Quran seems to be attributed to these eclipses. Now, whether that be a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, because if in fact these were just eclipses and the people living during this age, they would perhaps not really know what they were looking at. These eclipses would only be visible to those where the eclipse would take place. So if in fact there was an eclipse in the Middle East that was centered in the Middle East and others throughout Europe and Asia, they might not have been able to see this eclipse, and that would make this event strictly centered in this area, which could be a possible explanation for what the monks in Canterbury Cathedral said they saw, as this event that the monks witnessed seemed to be centered right there in Canterbury Cathedral and that nobody else saw it. So again, we will kind of circle back to the eclipse theory here in a little bit, but I just wanted to mention that to you, that perhaps these images of the splitting of the moon in the Muslim faith are often attributed to these eclipses, and that would make sense because if these eclipses were taking place in these Arab nations where Muslim is practiced as a religion, it would make sense because those eclipses would most likely be focused in that area, and that would be something that they would witness and not other countries would witness. So again, possible theory there. But where does that leave us here in terms of the story, in terms of the monks at Canterbury Cathedral, in terms of this image of the moon exploding into a giant fireball? Where does this leave us? Now, at this point, I wanted to try and find out more about some instances, of just any strange shit happening with the moon and what the monks could have possibly seen that night. And to be honest, I didn't see much about sightings regarding the moon splitting into pieces or anything like that. But what I did find, and I want to talk about briefly before we dive into theories, and that being volcanic activity. Now, volcanic activity on the moon is widely regarded to be over, as volcanoes on the moon don't act the same way as Earth's volcanoes do, and they're actually not really even active the same way the Earth's volcanoes do as well. However, this supposed sighting of one or possibly more instances of volcanic activity could change the way we view the moon and its history itself. Back in 1958, an astronomer named Nikolai Kozyrev would make the claim that he witnessed volcanic activity on the moon's surface. However, Kozyrev was a Russian, and during 1958, if you have any recollection of history, this was during the Cold War, and Kozyrev's claims would be scrutinized by American scientists, as this sighting, like I said, took place during the Cold War, and Americans and Russians did not like each other whatsoever. So if Kozyrev came out and made these claims, he was a Russian, hey, I saw volcanic activity on the moon, and I could see kind of these gases and the discharge of volcanic lava and things like that on the moon that we probably wouldn't normally think of seeing on the moon. American scientists chomped on the bit and said, this is false. They thought Kozyrev's claims were then accurate. And to this day, it seems kind of inconclusive whether or not Nikolai Kozyrev did in fact see volcanic activity on the moon, or perhaps he was just witnessing some type of gas phenomenon that we also don't explain. In addition to the volcano theory, you also have the idea of transient lunar phenomenon, or TLP for short. Now, TLP is a type of phenomenon witnessed by astronomers and is a term assigned to a sudden change of light, color, or appearance on the surface of the moon. Now, believe it or not, while TLPs aren't fully explainable and research is still ongoing, they are pretty well documented throughout history, and many astronomers have claimed to see weird lights and phenomenon occurring on the moon. There are so many that I could go back and list them, but by the time I would finish talking to you all, you would probably be sick of hearing my voice. So let me summarize. You have astronomers going all the way back to the early 1700s, making claims and making sightings of them seeing lights, strange glows, colored mists, and flashes of light taking place around the moon's various craters and mountain ranges. These sightings continued from the 1700s and into the 2000s. Now, that is 3 decades of these strange sightings of light phenomenon that, for the most part, remain unexplained. Now, we do have a few theories about what could be responsible, such as minor impact events like when space rock would collide with the moon's surface, kicking up dust and debris, or possibly even escaping gases from beneath the moon's surface. And when those gases are then exposed to outer space, they could be colored or looked colored. Now again, TLPs, like I mentioned, are not fully explainable yet, and research is still ongoing, but the fact that you have people documented throughout history of seeing weird flashes of light, glows coming from the moon. Some of these are crazy colors. You have some witnesses saying that they are yellow in color, that they are red, that they see white mists, that they see streaks of light they cannot explain. These are things that are legitimate claims that are being made on this transient lunar phenomenon, and we really don't have answers to them. We have some theories, some hypotheses, but we don't really have any explanations for them. And of course, I'm going to talk about that in theories, but I think up to this point, that might be the most compelling theory that we possibly have. However, like many sightings that we have discussed on this show, when it comes to, monsters or cryptids or even aliens and UFOs, what comes into question is these sightings made by a single observer. Now, that would make the single observer the only witness, thus no one could corroborate this sighting or this story. Now, I am not saying that all of these astronomers are lying, but it still kind of points to the idea that these sightings could be fabricated. These sightings of TLPs could be fabricated for reasons unknown because they were witnessed by one person. Again, this is not the case with all TLPs, as multiple people have witnessed them before. However, I did want to throw in that little kind of asterisk right there, as it might seem. However, to be honest with you, I think that is all the data and all the facts that I was able to dig up to lay all the cards out on the table, that everything I wanted to share with you before we dove into theories, because overall, the events of what happened in Canterbury, England are very limited. We have this one claim, and now we're left scratching our heads as to what possibly happened here. So I wanted to provide you with enough background as possible and possible background into these theories itself before we dive into theories. And without further ado, let's do that. Now, our first theory is meteor. Now, of course, like we mentioned, this probably wasn't a meteor that hit the side of the moon that created the Giordano Bruno crater. That most likely did not happen, just based on our now present understanding of the timeline of when Giordano Bruno crater was created. However, some have theorized that perhaps instead of this being some type of meteor or asteroid that collided with the moon, that this just happened to be a meteor that entered the Earth's atmosphere and exploded. How this could now kind of explain the images the monks saw of fire and the explosion, because realistically, fire doesn't work the same way fire works on Earth. Fire needs oxygen to work. So the idea that the monks described this huge explosion and fire kind of makes it seem that what they actually saw was something within the Earth's atmosphere that contained oxygen, and that's how they saw the fire. However, what the meteor theory doesn't explain is the idea of the moon turning black, or quote-unquote, throbbing like a wounded snake. This part kinda doesn't make sense, as the moon wouldn't throb or do anything like that. Of course, I am no scientist, but it seems to me that we almost have to decipher what is fact and what is fiction, and what is possibly what it is versus probably what it's not. On the surface, the meteor theory works. However, to me, it seems like it has too many holes for it to be our true culprit to this story. Now, the idea of a meteor entering Earth's atmosphere and exploding is not a new thing. You go all the way back in history, and there's the infamous Tunguska event, where the Tunguska meteor went into Tunguska, Siberia, and pretty much exploded and flattened out a huge swath of area in Siberia. That itself could be a whole episode, and I'll probably do one on it because it's a very, very fascinating event. However, that has happened before. So the idea that a meteor making it all the way through Earth's atmosphere and then exploding, and then these monks thinking that they're seeing something crash into the moon, when in reality it's their eyes playing tricks on them. This meteor came into the atmosphere, exploded by the moon, and then these monks thought they witnessed, the moon throbbing like a snake or catching on fire, when in reality that was something within their own atmosphere. Again, just my 2 cents. However, let's dive into a couple more theories here before I fully commit to one. Now, the second theory I want to share with you is lunar or solar eclipse. Now, this theory is what the monks witnessed that night at Canterbury Cathedral must have been some type of lunar or solar eclipse. Now, this is proposed as a theory in a few places, and I saw this when doing my research for this week's episode. However, I don't know if I can believe it to be the culprit here either. A lunar eclipse pretty much makes the moon progressively redder or orange in color, while going from a crescent all the way to a full moon. The fact that the moon remained a crescent that night through the monks' sighting and that the monks did not mention anything else about the moon's shape makes me skeptical. Of course, it could be possible that the monks witnessed this and then they went back inside into the cathedral and missed the moon becoming full again during the eclipse. However, that kind of seems like a stretch to me. However, this whole thing is a possibility. But just like I mentioned before, there has to be something left out of this story that we're just missing that helps us know truly what the monks saw and that we could put an actual scientific label on what happened, because we have so little information to go off of. I do think it is possible that the culprit in this case could be a solar eclipse. However, once I started to kind of think that, I thought a little bit deeper, and of course I am no scientist, so I'm like, oh, this could be a solar eclipse. As someone who just witnessed the solar eclipse last year, that was kind of a freaky event, if you've never seen it before. Once I started thinking about that a little bit more, and again, like I said, I am no scientist by any means, this theory of it being a solar eclipse goes out the wayside, because solar eclipses can only happen during the daytime, and not after sunset, like the monk's account describes. Now, the last theory I want to go over to, and maybe this is kind of like a two-part theory, or maybe there's a hidden fourth theory here, but this third theory I want to go into is called unexplained light phenomenon. Now, this last theory is whatever the monks witnessed that day is something that is truly unexplained up to this point, or some type of light phenomenon. Now, you could rope in the idea that perhaps maybe this was volcanic activity on the moon's surface that they were witnessed, and because of it, it would have caused these lights and appearances that people wouldn't normally see. However, there is very little evidence to prove this because, again, all we have is a story. Overall, I kind of like the idea that it was a meteor, and if the meteor kind of exploded in front of or behind the moon, it could make it seem like the moon was hit. But again, that kind of seems like a little bit of a stretch because you think that they would describe a rock going through the air. You would think that they would describe that. But again, you would think that we would also have some evidence documented throughout history's writings about these rocks and debris falling from the sky if, in fact, a meteor did explode in the atmosphere. Again, you would think we would have some documented evidence of that, and we honestly don't. Now, to be honest, this is one that I am truly stumped on. And of course, I could go with kind of the sneaky fourth theory that this was all made up and this was a hoax, but it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know why. This is 1178. It's not exactly like you're getting a hot off the presses story. It's not like you're getting front page on CNN. It's not like you're going on Fox News and getting a opening breaking story that you saw the moon explode into two pieces. This is 1178, and these are monks and a very known figure within the Christ Church of Canterbury with Gervase of Canterbury, and to me it just doesn't seem like this would be a story that they would make up. And I'm truly stumped by this because nothing seems to be an exact fill for what the monks saw or what they would describe to Gervase that night. And to be honest, until we either find more documentation or perhaps another culture speaking or having something documented on a similar event witnessed that day, we might not truly ever know what the monks saw that night in Canterbury, England. And although it is clear that the moon truly did not break in two, it is a fascinating reminder about the mysteries that lie in space and how much we truly don't know beyond the stars. But with that being said, that is going to do it for me on this week's episode. Again, I'm kind of stumped by this. If I were to guess, I would think that it's probably some type of light phenomenon. It seems to fit the most because my meteor theory kind of goes out the wayside once you start to think that there's no other culture up to this point that we've found that have documented a meteor exploding near the moon in 1178. So with me, I think I'm going to have to go the light phenomenon theory for now. But again, I truly don't know. However, if you have your own thoughts, your own theories on this, feel free to leave them in my comment section. Let me know Instagram direct message too. You can reach me there. Again, you can reach me at all my socials, Instagram, TikTok. You can email me. I'm all there. Spotify, YouTube. If you like this content, you want to hear more of this, I cover a whole wide swath of stuff. If this is your first experience with me, I cover cryptids, missing people, true crime, you name it, I cover it. Conspiracies too, the whole 9 yards. If you're listening to this for the first time, you're exploring my channel for the first time, please check out the rest of my content, and I greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, that is going to do it for me on this week's episode on the day the moon split in two. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the next one.